We were talking in the car on the way over here. The most common question I get asked is, how did I become interested in Jane Grey? I grew up, of course, in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, and in the 70s we got all the British BBC type programs that you guys produced on the Tudor period. I used to watch shows like Six Wives of Henry VIII, Elizabeth R. with Vanessa Redgrave, Men for All Seasons, Anne of the Thousand Days. That all created a very strong interest in me in British history. Then along came this disaster. In 1986, Paramount Pictures released the movie Lady Jane with Helena Bonham Carter and Carrie Elwes. And it is a tragic piece of history. That's why I've written rubbish across it quite as big as I can. But I knew that there had to be something more to the story. You know, this was obviously an anti-Thatcher, New Age, mysticism type of movie. You know, the slogan from the movie was "a shilling worth a shilling." It was clearly in opposition to Margaret Thatcher. So I wanted to do some research. I started doing some reading. Everything I read was basically a plagiarized version of Richard Davies' novel of 1909. And I thought, well, now what's the real story? At the time I was working as a registered nurse. So in 1995, when that career kind of evaporated, I made the decision to go back to university and to pursue this dream of studying Jane Grey. Got my BA, got an MA, got the PhD. My PhD dissertation was actually on Jane Grey. And that's what I've been doing ever since. That was 2007, and that's what I've been doing ever since. So why do we have a lot of myths about Jane Grey, but not a lot of facts? Or I should say, the facts that we have, so many of them are in fact actually myths. There's several reasons for that. One is a lot of the contemporary source material no longer exists. James and I were talking earlier. With a house like Bradgate, there would have been a muniments room where they would have kept all their deeds and account books and all that sort of stuff. Obviously, the house is a ruin. All those documents are gone. We just don't have them. They don't exist anywhere. With the absence of those materials, people have had to make it up as they go along. A lot of what we think we know about Jane Grey right now is actually a product of religious propaganda, political propaganda, and even social propaganda. You have writings that want to take advantage of her as a religious figure, as a political figure, and particularly in the Victorian era when people like Agnes Strickland and Richard Davey were writing, they wanted to use Jane Grey as a vehicle for promoting certain ideas. So they would reshape the story using dramatic license to create what wasn't there. Two, there were a lot of dramas, stage dramas, and epic poems, and those sorts of things that came out that told a totally fictionalized story, but they became embedded in the, quote, history as factual. I don't know if any of you know the book, The Tower of London by Richard Ainsworth. It was written in about 1840, 1850. It's a novel. It was taught in the British secondary school system as fact until the 1950s. And then somebody finally woke up one day and said, this is a novel, we can't do this. So what are the principal myths? The first one is her date of birth. Second one is her place of birth, which of course has a direct impact on Bradgate. Bradgut, I'll leave it to you guys to correct me. We had a discussion about that as well. Her education, how well was she or was she not educated? Social isolation, that's another one of the big myths. Disciplined harshly. That's one that comes out really, really big in the 1986 film. There's a scene of her bent over a stool and her mother and her maid are having a fight about who's going to whip her with a bundle of sticks. Exceptional piety. She's certainly remembered as a Protestant martyr who was, basically praying 24 hours a day. Her habits of dress. In the modern world, she's almost always portrayed as wearing dark and somber clothing, what Americans would call Puritan dress. And her place of burial. How many people think she was buried in the Tower of London? Show of hands, go ahead. Nope. So, the first myth. Jane Grey Dudley was born on the 12th of October, 1537. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography's entry on Lady Jane Grey states this as fact. And it has the imprimatur of Oxford behind it, so it must be true, right? Wrong. Where did the myth come from? This is an engraving that George Vertue produced in 1749. And to my knowledge, it's the first time that anyone ever assigned a specific age and therefore rough time when Jane Grey was born. Prior to that, she was universally described as being young, 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 young. Nobody ever said she's XYZ years old. So you can see in his engraving, has her age 16, and then it says she died in 1554. Do the math, she must have been born in, what, that would give you 1538. Then in 1761, George de la Haye wrote this very long titled book, and he says, born in 1537. Probably took that from Vertue, which had come out only a few years earlier. That engraving was extremely widely circulated. There are a gazillion copies of it. I actually own a copy myself. It hangs over my desk. Then Thomas Gibbons wrote The Life and Death of Jane Grey, and in the title he states that she was 18 at the time of her death. William Godwin, another very well-known writer, says she was born in 1537. Nicholas Harris Nicholas wrote The Literary Remains of Lady Jane Grey. That's a very well-known book. He says about 1537. Agnes Strickland. Are any of you familiar with Agnes Strickland's books? She was hugely popular in the middle of the 19th century. She wrote lots and lots of books about women in particular. She wrote a book on the Tudor princesses. She wrote books on each of the wives of Henry VIII. She wrote multi-volume series. She was very well known and very influential. She says Jane was born in October 1537, and she adds, out of nowhere, very nearly at the same time as her royal cousin, Prince Edward. Why did she do that? Because she wanted to bring Protestant martyr Jane together with Protestant reformer Edward and create an association in the mind between these two people. Then we have Richard Davey, whom I've already mentioned, Life and Times of Jane Grey from 1909. He says October 1537. Hester Chapman. Backtracking to Davey for a second, he was principally a novelist. He was not a historian. And the field of history that we know it today had not yet developed. We didn't have the standards and the sort of methodologies that we have today. Hester Chapman was another novelist primarily. She says the exact date in 1537 is not recorded, but it's still 1537, probably October. Alison Plowden, another novelist. She said the exact date is not recorded. I use LJG as my shorthand. Not recorded, although the month is said to have been October. Plowden was another very influential writer on Jane Grey, even though she basically plagiarized Richard Davey's novel. There are entire chunks of Plowden's book that are word for word the same as Richard Davey. 1985, Mary Luke published The 9 Days Queen. This book is very strange. It was published by the publisher as fact. And Luke even has a preface to the book where she defends the idea that it is a fact-based book. It is a novel. She has all sorts of dialogue and inner thoughts and feelings and all that sort of stuff that just are not documented. It falls into the realm of a novel. But she's the first to say that Edward and Jane were born on the same day. Plowden again, 2003, to capitalize on a major anniversary of Jane Grey's reign, re-released her book under a new title, same book, almost exactly the same wording, same statement. Exact day not known, but probably in October. Plowden died in 2007, but before she died, she wrote the entry that still exists in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. So this is a novelist writing an article for a very important, prestigious, fact-based book like the Encyclopedia Britannica. She says, 12th October, repeating Mary Luke from the novel. Then along came smart alecky American me. I published a couple of articles and notes and queries in 2007. I went back and looked at the original primary sources, which we're going to go through in a second, and I said sometime between October 1536 and May 1537. And oh my God, you would have thought that I had said the world was coming to an end. Wikipedia went ballistic on me. I actually had a woman from northern Italy who got in touch with me and said, "You're wrong. You've got to be wrong. I've done her astrological chart. Her astrological chart says absolutely she was born on the 12th of October 1537. There's no other way. The planets say so." This went on for months on Wikipedia. Wikipedia now says what I say, by the way. Then Leonda Delisle, local resident, she lives quite nearby, practically walking distance, said no firm position, but the context where she throws in the birth suggests that it was very close to the birth of Edward VI. Then Eric Ives, best known for his work on Anne Boleyn, who was, by the way, the first recognized scholar ever to do anything with Jane Grey. So 2009, and that's the first time an academic has touched Jane Grey in a really large sense. He said the year 1537 seems correct, perhaps in the spring rather than the fall. Finally, Nicola Tallis put out Crown of Blood. She's a protege of Alison Weir. I'm sure many of you know who Alison Weir is. She's very similar to Alison Weir in her methodology, and I'll just leave it to you guys to decide whether that's good or bad. She said the likeliest date of birth is in the latter half of 1536. So what evidence do we have? Roger Ascham is one of the first ever to mention Jane Grey's age during her own lifetime. He did this. He visited her here at Bradgate in August of 1550, and then he wrote this letter some months later back to Jane and her tutor John Aylmer, and he noted that she was 15 years old by August 1550. That would have made her born in 1535, which is earlier than anybody else has said so far. Ascham was tutor to Elizabeth. He did not know Jane Grey well. He did know her. He did speak with her several times, but people in this era were not as concerned with age as we are today. There were three important ages in that period: the age of 7, the age of 14, and the age of 21, because they marked a period where you were out of infancy into childhood. 14 was the age of, you were supposed to know the difference between sin and not sin, basically, how to make proper judgments. And of course, 21 is when you came into property. Other than those specific age markers, people didn't care a whole lot about age. When have you ever heard anyone describe Henry VIII as being XYZ years old at a certain time? But Ascham said she was 15. Her own tutor, John Aylmer, in a letter dated from May 1551, said in Latin, he said she was fully 14 years old at the time. That would have made her born before May of 1536. As her tutor for many, many years, Aylmer knew her well, so his assessment of her age is probably pretty accurate. Thomas Challoner did not know Jane Grey, but he was a contemporary. He was actually out of the country for most of her lifetime. But he wrote an elegy on her death in 1579. An elegy is a type of long, epic poem that the whole goal of it is to praise the dead and make them seem to be, it's like we go to a funeral today. Everybody loved him, he was a wonderful person, blah, 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 blah. That's what an elegy is about. But elegies have a very specific, they're a poem, and they have a very specific form that they have to follow, poetic meter. I'm sure you guys have heard about Shakespeare and iambic pentameter and that sort of thing. Because he had to follow that meter, he changed the way he expressed the age. And he said in Latin, he said she had scarcely spent 3 sixes of years. 3 sixes, that's an odd way to do it. My suspicion is that he did that simply to meet the poetic meter. But this would make her born before February of 1536. So as you can see, 1535, 36, 36, we've got a whole mixture here. Michelangelo Florio. He was Jane's Latin tutor. He actually wrote a book about Latin grammar for her. He didn't know her real well, but he knew her the last couple of years of her life. He said she was 17 years old at the time of her death. That would make her born before February 1537. So, what is the fact? The fact is we don't know. In all likelihood, she was born certainly before May of 1537, perhaps as early as October of 1536, perhaps even, if Ascham is right, as early as 1535. But the basic point is we don't know her date of birth, and she was older than we commonly think she was. And somebody needs to make the Oxford Dictionary update it. It's a little article. Second myth. Uh-oh. Jane was born at Bradgate House. Bradgate or Bradgate? Which do you prefer? Bradgate. Okay. Bradgate House. This is a traditional assumption. Have no idea where this one came from. But it was well established by 1671, certainly. And we see that George Delahaye produced a book called The General History of the Lives, on and on and on and on. Principal seat of the Marquess of Dorset was the stately house of Bradgate, as it was spelled back then, in Leicestershire, where it is generally believed, though there is no direct authority to prove it, that the Lady Jane was born. And that's the only documented statement, that's the first documented statement, and everybody seems to have followed from that. The evidence is entirely circumstantial. But we now know that Bradgate House was built beginning in or after 1540, well after Jane Grey was born. No house cannot have been born here. The hunting lodge that existed would not have been adequate, at least the dimensions of the hunting lodge that we know about right now. That's not a substantial enough house to support Frances Brandon Grey during her customary lying-in period that started 40 days before birth and extended 40 days after. Do you know what I mean when I say a lying-in period? Okay, the ladies are all shaking their heads, the men are going, huh? A lying-in period, a lady withdrew to her private bedchamber and stayed there. Curtains drawn, in the dark, to protect themselves from the miasmas outside and all this other stuff, to keep from harming the infant. So they basically imagine, ladies, 40 days before you have a baby, you withdraw to your bedroom and you don't come out again until 80 days later. How does that sound? So you're going to want a reasonable quality of building to be in for this. And the hunting lodge that was here was probably not adequate for that. Plus, Henry Grey was in a constant fight with his mother through this period. He and his mother were going round and round about who was going to pay whose bills. Henry had married, obviously, and he was being supported by Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. And that was a contractual agreement that had been made. But his mother started complaining that she was having to pay his bills because he was overspending and the creditors were coming to her wanting bills paid. So, does Frances really want to go have a baby in the home of her mother-in-law who's kind of pissed off at you to begin with? Probably not. 2, events in London during 1536 and 1537 would have required Henry Grey's presence in London. As Marquess of Dorset, he was one of the highest-ranking peers of the realm. Anne Boleyn had just been tried and executed. He needed to be in London for a lot of that stuff. Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. There was a coronation for Jane Seymour planned in the summer of 1536. Henry would have had a prominent role in that coronation. He needed to be there. And then there were other political events that I won't go into that occurred during this period, most of it related to the religious changes, that Henry just needed to be in London through this period. He could not have been lollygagging up here in the Midlands. Leander de Lisle was the first to suggest that Jane Grey was born somewhere other than Bradgate, sorry. And she suggested that Jane Grey was born at Dorset House in the Strand. This is stuck, and there's been a number of people that have repeated this since then. The only problem with that is that there was no Dorset House in London in the Tudor period. It simply wasn't there. There was a house where Dorset House eventually was, but it was at that time called Salisbury Inn, and it was the home of the bishops of Salisbury. It did not become known as Dorset House until after 1604, when it had reverted to the crown and been granted out again, and the Sackville Earls of Dorset owned it, rebuilt it, and if you go there today, you will still see, in London, you'll still see the streets where Dorset House was. It's occupied by big commercial buildings now. So as I said, Henry Grey was in wardship to Charles Brandon and was supported by Charles Brandon until 1531. And we know that Henry spent a lot of time in his father-in-law's household. Brandon owned 2 properties here in London. He had Norwich Inn, the former home of the bishops of Norwich, and he had the Barbican, also known as Base Court. That's the same Barbican as the Barbican Centre in London today. Now, Suffolk Place, don't confuse that with the Suffolk Place that was in Southwark on the south side of the Thames. Brandon had to give that one up, and he traded it for Norwich Inn. And the original Suffolk Place became a residence for Anne of Cleves. So this is an old map of London that's roughly contemporary. This is late 16th century. And this shows where Dorset Place would be. This is where Norwich Inn was, and this is the Palace of Whitehall right here. So it was quite close to the court. The Barbican, on the other hand, is in the northwest corner of the old walled city. So, fact. Again, we simply don't know where Jane Grey was born. But the greatest likelihood, I think, is that she was born at the Barbican. She may also have been born at Norwich Inn, but my suspicion is the Barbican, because a lot of Brandon's letters are addressed from the Barbican rather than from Norwich Inn. He seems not to have used that house very much. Next myth. Jane Grey was exceptionally well educated. This is a very well-known myth. I'm sure you're all aware of it. And indeed, her contemporary reputation, her scholarly achievements were the main thing that everybody mentioned. Anybody talking about Jane Grey, writing letters to each other, this girl is so well educated, it's amazing. Roger Ascham, who was again tutor to Elizabeth I, directly compared the education of Jane Grey with that of Elizabeth and also with that of Edward VI. We know that Jane was able to translate Heinrich Bullinger's De Matrimonii on marriage from Latin to ancient Greek as a gift for her father. She did this when she was about 14. Imagine translating an entire book from Latin to ancient Greek when you're only 14. It's pretty remarkable. We also know that she corresponded in Latin with several religious reformers on the continent. Latin was the lingua franca of the period. Everybody corresponded rather than, do you speak my language? Everybody used Latin. And Jane seems to have been quite fluent in Latin. And she states in at least one letter to Bullinger that she was teaching herself Hebrew, and she wrote in Hebrew a couple of lines into the letter. Now, one of her tutors had been Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken, and probably started out teaching her Hebrew. But he left the household, so she had to start teaching herself. And in this letter, she actually writes to Bullinger and says, what's the best way for me to go about doing this? What's the best text for me to use to teach myself Hebrew? Jane also got a gift from Mildred Cecil, wife of Sir William Cecil, of the works of St. Basil written in the original ancient Greek. At this time, William Cecil was nobody. He was not even Secretary of the Council quite yet. But his wife, Mildred, was a daughter of Anthony Browne, and she and her sisters were known for being extremely well educated. We know that Michelangelo Florio tutored Jane in Tuscan, which an Italian dialect. Most English people referred to Italian as Tuscan in this period. And as I said, he wrote a Tuscan grammar for her that still exists in its original form in the British Library. Challoner's elegy again said that Jane spoke English, French, Italian, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Chaldee, which we today call Aramaic. The likelihood that she understood Arabic and Chaldee is extremely slim. This is probably a product of Challoner doing what elegies do, praising the deceased all the way to the stars. But certainly these languages she did know. So, modern studies of the literacy rates in England in this period show that the literacy rate for men was probably less than 10%. Very few people could read and write in this period. Literacy rate for women was less than 5%. And fewer than a dozen women of the 16th century are documented to have been able to read and write Latin. This is based on research done by Barbara Harris at the University of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Education of women was considered a route to temptation and a danger to their immortal soul. This was an era when you had books like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, full of all sorts of bawdiness. The Decameron by, suddenly I'm drawing a blank. It'll come to me. It'll come to me in a minute. But anyway, there was a lot of sort of secular material going around, and it was thought that women, oh my God, if they read this stuff, they're just going to lose it, and they're going to become just basically sluts in the street, excuse my expression. But we do know that Jane studied rhetoric and philosophy from the ancient Greek and Latin texts. She read Demosthenes. She read a lot of these Ciceronian orations. She studied theology using the works of the Church Fathers. And we know this because I was able to trace the library that her tutor owned. He had an inventory of the books that he owned at that time, and if he had them, almost certainly he used them to teach Jane Grey, because books were very valuable and people did not own a lot of them. So what he had at hand was what he used to teach her. Now, he was primarily teaching her language, but in the course of doing all this translating, she cannot help but have absorbed a lot of the actual ideological content of these works. And she also studied music. And there's a very famous line in one of Aylmer's letters where he's really aggravated at Jane because she spends too much time with music and too much time with braidings of the hair. Apparently she was a bit vain. So, fact. This is one that's on the list that's actually true. Jane Grey was, in fact, one of the best educated English females of the 16th century. And her scholarly attainments probably exceeded a lot of men in the university. She would have probably been quite capable of being a university don at Oxford or Cambridge, which is a remarkable thing for a woman who was only 16 or 17 years old when she died. Imagine a modern 16-year-old being able to do that sort of thing. Next myth. Jane Grey Dudley lived her life in self-imposed isolation at Bradgate. This has its origins probably in Ascham's letter, where he famously found her in her father's hall reading the Phaedo of Aristotle instead of being out hunting with the family. From that, everyone's extrapolated that she must have hated being around people and she must have stayed indoors all the time. Then in 1853, John Calcott Horsley, a very well-known mid-19th century artist who painted scene paintings, historical scene paintings, produced a painting of that scene. There we go. This is the painting, and then it was published as an engraving. And engravings were hugely popular in the 19th century, widely circulated, so this was seen by lots and lots and lots of people. To this day, you can buy that engraving on eBay. Multiple copies of it are always listed. And you can see the hunting party outside, and Jane said, Now imagine, for those of you that work on the history of Bradgate, imagine Ascham walking up to the window and peering in like that. Big step ladder. But there's a lute down here in the corner. Her music. So in his novel of 1909, Richard Davey described her as poor, isolated girl. We cannot but feel more of pity than admiration. As down the long vista of 4.5 centuries, we picture her sitting alone, poring over her Fido, poor thing. As I said, one of the most influential writers about her, and it stuck. Hester Chapman repeated it, as she did everything else, Davey said. Capacity for self-isolation. And then that horrendous movie shows her distancing herself from everyone, and it goes off into the new agey mysticism business where she's, on the bed and Jonathan Livingston Seagull and all that kind of business. If we turn to the primary source evidence, however, we know that Jane traveled frequently with her parents. We know that she lived with Catherine Parr for a number of years. And in Catherine Parr's household was a large cohort of very well-known, very well-educated, mostly reformist women, people like Catherine Willoughby Brandon and quite a number of others. And they were all, the thing was to sit around and to talk with each other. So she was socializing. We know that she visited Lady Mary at Newhall at least once, perhaps multiple times. Her and Lady Mary, Princess Mary, seem to have been relatively close. It's documented that she participated in the public progress of Mary of Guise. Mary was returning from France to Scotland, and her ship got blown ashore at Portsmouth or Plymouth or one of those. And she had to come up through London and go by overland, and she was received at Hampton Court and then again in London by Edward VI. There's all these street progresses and stuff, and Jane was present through all of that. That's very well documented. We know that she attended the state receptions at Westminster for Mary of Guise. In this period, if somebody had failed to meet their social expectations, it would have been noticed. People would have remarked on it. So ambassadors or someone would have left a letter saying, this girl's not doing as we expect her to do, she wasn't there, whatever. That doesn't happen. There's no observer comment about her being not present. So the fact is she probably did not self-isolate, and neither did she remain always at Bradgate. Next myth, and this is another one, very well known. There's a hideous scene, I think I just mentioned it, in the movie where she's being whipped with reeds while bent over a chair. So a lot of modern people in this very sensitive, the woke world, Jane was apparently abused. That has its origins, once again, with Roger Ascham. He wrote a book in 1570. This is a picture of the title page. The book is a sort of prescription for people how to teach children. Up to that point, teaching was done with physical correction. Spell something wrong, rod across the palm of the hand. Get a fact wrong, Columbus sailed in 1493, nope, rod across the hand. Ascham was more in favor of kindness and positive, what we would today call positive reinforcement. That's entirely what the book is about. So he presented this story. This is supposedly Jane's words, and Jane supposedly said, when I'm in presence of either of father or mother, whether I speak, keep silence, sit, stand, go, eat, drink, be merry, sad, sewing, playing, dancing, or doing anything else, I must do it, as it were, in such a weight, measure, and number, even so perfectly as God made the world, or else I am so sharply taunted, so cruelly threatened, yea, presently sometimes with pinches, nips, and bobs, and other ways, which I will not name for the honor of my parents, so without measure misordered that I think myself in hell. This was almost certainly a fabrication on Ascham's part. Why is that? Jane's complaint would have been absolutely out of order in that era. Ascham was a man, she was a woman. Ascham was older, she was younger. He was of lower status, she was of higher status. So for her to make this kind of complaint to him would have violated so many social strictures that that would have been the focus. Not whether or not she was abused, but what an upstart, loudmouth little girl she was. And that wasn't the case. All discipline of this period was harsh and usually corporal, including for adults. I'm sure we've all heard about fingers being chopped off for this or that. You lose a hand for stealing. You get your ear nailed to the pillory and have to rip your ear off to get loose. That was common practice. You know, the death penalty was the punishment for a wide range of crimes that today would just horrify us. Proper physical discipline is also an ancient biblical tenet. Proverbs 13:24, he that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. Spare the rod, spoil the child. And advice manuals of the period often offered instructions to parents on how to discipline their children physically. And this was extreme. Time out is a modern construct. That's not something that existed back then. If a child did something wrong back then, you just whacked them. So in 1559, Barthélemy Batt wrote A Christian Man's Closet. And then this was how to govern a household. And it was directed at the father of the household. And he said, fear is to be driven unto children, correction and punishment is to be given, that being brought into some fear they may leave their wickedness. And he went on to say, use the rod, beat them. And he told them where to beat them and how to beat them. He even told them how not to beat them. Avoid fists to the ears and head, lest with their rigor and cruelty parents might murder their children. Parents must take care that they beat them not like asses. Clearly, parents were being instructed to whack the daylights out of their kids as much as they could. Then in 1598, somewhat later, but still valid during Jane's lifetime, one stripe will do more good to a child in time than 100 stripes afterwards. If you catch them, strike them. Yes, Jane Grey was physically disciplined, certainly. Was it abuse? No, not by the standards of the era. By our standards, perhaps, but by the standards of the era, no. Jane was exceptionally pious, a Protestant martyr saint. I'm sure you've all heard that particular myth. The origins of this come from a publication in 1554 that focuses almost exclusively on her religious-themed writings. All of the letters that survive from her are mostly on religious topics. So if you publish nothing but religious topics about a person, then the person must have been religious, right? And John Foxe put her in his Acts and Monuments, or Book of Martyrs. That's the biggest item that created this myth. But he established her as a specifically religious martyr rather than a political one. Jane Grey did not die for her faith. She died because she committed treason, and that's not a religious act. And then there's this story that was included in Foxe. This is kind of a fun story, actually. When she was very young at Newhall in Essex at the Lady Mary's, was by one Lady Anne Wharton desired to walk. They went for a stroll inside the house. And they passing by the chapel, the Lady Wharton made low curtsy to the Popish sacrament, hanging on the altar. Would have been in a monstrance. Do you know what monstrances are? These big sculptural things, stars and bars and all kinds of things, and they have a big crystal window in them, and they would put a communion wafer inside the crystal window and leave it on top of the altar, and this was a consecrated host, so it was the body of Christ sitting on the altar. So when you walked by it, you were supposed to genuflect and bow or curtsy or whatever. Which when the Lady Jane saw, marveled why she did so and asked whether the Lady Mary were there. Is Lady Mary here? Is that why you're curtsying? And the Lady Wharton answered, no, she made curtsy to him that made us all. And quoth the Lady Jane, how can he be there that made us all when the baker made him? This story is probably true because in that era, people tended to get very aggressive about defending their religious beliefs, but this is not something that Jane Grey came up with on her own doing. It's not as though she were terribly clever. This probably, I have not found the precise source of it yet, but it almost certainly comes from somebody else. I think it may actually come from Anne Askew, the famous Protestant preacher and martyr. And look at what I wrote here. Life and Death and Actions of the Most Chaste. This is an anonymous piece. And it started the idea that she was specifically a Protestant martyr. And it was a foil for the debates, religious debates that were going on at the time. The Hampton Court Conference had met in 1604. This was the year after James I came to the throne. He had come down from Scotland and he was out of the Scottish Kirk as opposed to the Church of England. So there was a big debate. This was an era when the religion of the monarch was the religion of the realm. So were we all going to be Presbyterian? Were we going to be Church of England? What were we going to be? They had this big conference, and in the wake of it, there was a lot of discussion about which direction the church should take. They brought Lady Jane Grey out as a way to use a dead person to put into her dead mouth the argument for and against the two sides of the debate. This is part of the religious propaganda stuff. Thomas Fuller did the same thing. Notice the date, 1656. That's the middle of the Commonwealth period. Very Puritan, very stripped down church, no vestments, no altars, a very Puritan type church. Fuller was arguing against that. He wanted to go back to the Henrician church that was more of a high church settlement. Peter Heylin, same thing, 1661, 1 year after the restoration of Charles II. Were we going to remain with the Commonwealth Puritan Church, or were we going to move back into the Church of England? Heylin was arguing very much to go back to the old Henrician church and to abandon the stripped down church of the Commonwealth period. Thomas Fuller, same year, History of the Worthies of England. Jane figures in that as an example of the dangers of what a high Catholic church kind of settlement could be to people. If Jane died because of Catholics taking over, then we need to avoid Catholics taking over. Same thing, 1688, the Glorious Revolution. James II is deposed, William and Mary come in. They published the debate between Lady Jane and Feckenham concerning the Blessed Sacrament. This is the core debate always between reformers and Catholics. The nature of the sacrament. Is it really the body and blood of Christ, or is it merely something done in remembrance of? Catholics, of course, believe it's the actual blood and body. Reformers not. Jane kind of almost won this debate, so they republished it to promote the Reform or Protestant viewpoint. 1715, another key year. This is the death of Queen Anne, and George I of Hanover was going to come over and become King of England. There were those who thought that James II's sons should be king, but they were Catholic. So Nicholas Rowe wrote a stage play, Tragedy in 5 Acts, massively popular. This would have been the Phantom of the Opera of its day. It would have been in the theater constantly for a long, long time. It is still reprinted to this day. It went through several hundred reprints since its publication. And in this, Jane Grey argues over and over and over again for the Protestant form of religion. Nicholas Rowe became poet laureate as a result. George I was so pleased with it that he made Nicholas Rowe poet laureate. Contemporary observers called her godly, They didn't usually call her pious. I know of one instance where they did. But they also called Henry VIII godly. He had mistresses. He had illegitimate children. He got married 6 times. He divorced them. He cut their heads off. He was godly? By that standard, yeah, Jane was pretty godly. Contemporary observers remarked on her education, not her piety. She did not stand out for that among people during her own lifetime. John Aylmer, her tutor, actually found that she was insufficiently observant. As I said, too much time with music and braidings of the hair. He was so desperate that he wrote to Heinrich Bullinger and said, please help me with these people. You're such an important figure. Write to her parents, tell her how to behave properly because she's not behaving. And religion in this period was an integral part of daily life. It's not like it was today. Wealthy people got up and went to Mass when it was still Catholicism. Catholicism was the major religion. And as we see right here at Bradgate, there's a chapel attached to the house. How many people have chapels attached to their houses today? Nobody does. Religion was an everyday thing. So being religious was not the same as being pious. And other women of the period were more, quote, pious than she was. Catherine Parr in particular. Catherine Parr published 3 books on religious subjects, one called Lamentation of a Sinner that was entirely her own writing, came out of her own head. Catherine Willoughby Brandon, that's the step-grandmother of Jane Grey, patronized a number of reforming religious figures. These women are more nearly pious than Jane Grey was, but none of them are remembered today as being pious. So the fact is, there's no evidence at all to suggest that Jane Grey was exceptionally pious. If anything, she was more probably conventionally pious, no more or less religious than anybody else around her. Jane Grey habitually wore dark, plain, somber clothing. This started in 1721 when John Strype published basically a biography of her tutor, John Aylmer, who later became Bishop of London. In that book, Strype quotes Aylmer as saying, "A great man's daughter." Now notice Jane's name is not actually attached to this. "A great man's daughter who, having received from the Lady Mary goodly apparel of tinsel cloth of gold and velvet, when she saw it, said, 'What shall I do with it?' 'Mary,' said a gentleman woman standing by her, 'wear it.' 'Nay,' answered Jane, 'that were a shame to follow my Lady Mary against God's words, and leave Lady Elizabeth, which followeth God's word.'" So this seems to imply that Elizabeth dressed plainly as well. Strype's anecdote must be interpreted in its historical context. This was a period when there were laws in place about what you could and could not wear. Certain people could wear ermine, certain people could not. Certain people could wear fox fur, certain people could not. Certain people could wear silk, satin, certain colors. It was very, very extensive and very, very rigid. Tinsel cloth of gold was something that was reserved for the very highest rank, primarily the crown itself. So for Jane to have put on tinsel cloth of gold would have basically have been her trying to be something she was not. It would be her dressing up as her superiors, which was not something that one would do. No contemporary observer ever remarked on her attire. Imagine you show up at a Progress for Mary of Guise where everybody's in their finest jewels and feathers and furs, and here she comes in her little black dress. People would have noticed that, and they would have commented on it. No comments exist. In every portrait produced in the 175 years after Jane Grey's death, she's depicted wearing fine jewels and fine attire. The first portrait of her to appear in print depicted her in those fine jewels and attire, as does the famous Stephan portrait that you've got in the gift center here, the visitor center, though it dates to the 1590s, so it's not an accurate portrait. That is the Stephan portrait. You'll recognize it. This is the first image of Jane Grey ever published. was published in 1620. And in the introduction to the book that it was published in, the engraver said that he strived to make sure that the images he used were authentic images of the people involved. In actuality, that's copied from a portrait of Catherine Parr. That's directly traceable to a portrait of Catherine Parr. So the artist made a mistake, and we're living with this mistake to this day. The first published portrait of her in somber attire didn't appear until 1824. And that's this one. This is owned, the original painting is still owned by one of the local nobles. And it actually does not depict Jane Grey at all. It depicts Mary Neville Fine's Lady Dacre. So it's a portrait of someone else, and she's in widow's attire, by the way. These white hoods in that era were commonly worn by widows. So the fact is, there's just no evidence to indicate that she dressed habitually in dark, plain, or somber clothing. Circumstantially, she most certainly dressed the way that everybody around her did. Jane Grey was buried in the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London. Everybody's heard that, right? If you've ever been to the Tower of London, they do a big tour. They show you where her head was cut off. They show you the plaque on the floor in the chapel. This is, of course, the chapel. I don't know if you're aware, all of this grass area out here, that is originally a cemetery. There are several hundred, perhaps more than 1,000 people buried underneath that grass. There are old images of the tower where there were still gravestones and stuff out there. But this is we were talking about this earlier, this is the marker where the tower claims that the scaffold originally was. It was put in 10, 15 years ago. Has a nice frosted glass pillow on it where they laid their head. There's just one problem with that. It's not where the scaffold was. We know that for sure. That's not where it was. The folks in the tower like to create things for the tourists. But this is the interior of the chapel, and Jane is supposedly buried right there, right next to the altar. Remember that. What's the origin of it? Nobody knows. Traditional assumption, perhaps? No contemporary source identifies where she was buried. Nobody says she was buried in the Tower of London. They say her head was struck off, and then the story drops. Chapel's burial registry for this period is very fragmentary and incomplete. It does list a number of burials in this general period, but hers is not among them. And in 1876-77, there was a big project done to refurbish the chapel. They took up the entire floor and they started looking for who was buried underneath. And they did some very primitive archaeological digs. And Doyne Bell was present for these, and he wrote a big account of it. And it was published in 1877. And this is a drawing, that's the altar that I just pointed to a while ago. The Duke of Monmouth is supposedly buried directly beneath it in 1785. Lord Rochford, that was Anne Boleyn's brother. Anne Boleyn, Duke of Somerset, the Lord Protector, Duke of Northumberland. He was Catholic, so he could be buried there. We'll come back to that. Howard, Lady Rochford, Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law, I think it was. Countess of Salisbury, de la Pole. And then here comes Guilford, Lady Jane, and her father, next to the Duke of Norfolk and several others. Now, these are all also known Catholics. These were all Protestant. Roman Catholic burial practices suggest that she must have been buried somewhere else. The Roman Catholic Church buries its dead in consecrated ground. If you're buried in a Roman Catholic church under the floor, your proximity to the altar is based on your status. The closer you are to the altar, quite literally the closer you are to God, because that monstrance is up there with the body of Christ stuck in the middle of it. So you're telling me that Protestant heretic Jane Grey was buried right up next to the altar, next to the monstrance and the body of Christ? Probably not. Then we have the mummified head of Henry Grey. Whoops. Come on, stop it. There we go. This was found in 1851. It's a bit ghoulish. Found in 1851 in the vault of the Church of Holy Trinity Minories. And in a very odd sort of route, the director of the National Portrait Gallery at the time, George Scharf, was asked to examine the head and to compare it to a portrait that they thought was a portrait of Henry Grey. And he said, oh yeah, that's Henry Grey's head. Certainly. Definitely, definitely. Only problem is he was comparing it to a portrait of someone other than Henry Grey. So he was way off base. The head still exists. It's at the Church of St. Botolph without Aldgate. And I've been in touch with the rector there, and they confirm it does still exist, but no, they will not tell anybody where it actually is. Rumor has it it's buried outside in the churchyard somewhere. If we could dig it up and do DNA studies, you can extract DNA from the teeth sometimes, we might be able to figure out something, but nobody's interested in that right now. So here's the Tower of London, down here. That's where the Church of Holy Trinity Minories was. Very close. It's actually 1,500 feet, I measured it, from the north wall of the tower here to the church. If Henry Grey was buried there, probably Jane Grey was too. And why do I say that? The Church of Holy Trinity Minories was a dissolved abbey. Henry Grey owned it. That was Henry Grey's property. So his servants could easily have come down to the tower, grabbed up Guilford, grabbed up Jane, and grabbed up Henry, who had his head whacked off a few days later, and hauled them up there and buried them there, because they could not be buried in a Catholic chapel in the tower. I think that's where she was actually buried. The folks at the Tower of London are not happy with me. That's the site today. It's a hotel motel. But you can see Minories Street in London. So the location of Jane Grey's grave is undocumented and unknown, almost certainly not the Tower of London. I really think she was buried at the Church of Holy Trinity Minories. And now I'll entertain questions.
Thank you very much.
I did put up my email address if you ever want to contact me. somegraymatter.com is my website. It's in the process of being updated. It looks like it came out of 1990 because it did. So I have a guy who's revising it for me and making it look much slicker. And that should be available about the 15th of this month. So don't look at it yet. Wait a week or two. Any questions about anything? It doesn't have to be about this. It could be anything to do with Jane Grey.
Yeah. Anybody? Questions?
Oh, come on. Somebody must have a question.
Does that coincide or change or make you think about the stories you know and tell from?
I think we're going to have to go back and redo some of those questions.
I spotted some of those questions in the chapel. We were walking around the ruins earlier, and I spotted some of those questions, and I thought,
I mean, there's the questions, but then there's the answers.
that too.
Yeah, well, we haven't told you those yet.
Stephen, what's your hypothesis then, together with the research that Nick has done, on Jane Grey's whereabouts, circa 1547 onwards, in terms of Bradgate House?
That's a good question. I don't know how much you guys are aware of all the archaeology and stuff, how much you've been told about the results and stuff of that. But it looks pretty much at this point like the Greys did not occupy the house until 1547. The house was under construction before then. So in all likelihood, Jane Grey did not take up residence in this house until she was at least 10 years old. She spent time between 1547 and 1553 here, but not before 1547. Does that answer your question?
Is there any evidence beyond 1547, but to the Ascom letters, of her being at Bradgate Park?
Yes. Yes, there's quite a number of letters that are, back in those days, we say they endorsed their letters. They would always say written at so-and-so place on this date. And there's a lot of letters that are written after 1547 from here, none before, that I've been able to find, which suggests they weren't living in the house at that point. But both parents wrote letters from here. Aylmer wrote letters from here. Jane wrote letters from here. And some of the people that they patronized, some of the religious reformers, would come and visit and pick up their pensions and that sort of thing, and they would write letters from here. So we know that the house was pretty actively occupied after 1547, but there's nothing to say that it was occupied before.
My last question. How often do you think the house is occupied in a typical year?
That's a good question. The Greys owned a lot of properties. A lot. As you know, they owned Gruby. Thank you for correcting me on my pronunciation of that one. Close by, they owned Astley Castle, though it was probably in a ruin by the time they owned it. They owned Beaumont. There were so many manors that they owned, and households tended to circulate because of fear of contagion. And you know, these were houses that did not have central plumbing, did not have central heating, did not have toilets. So people were, I mean, if you've ever been to Versailles, you hear the stories about people peeing in the stairwells. That happened in these houses too. So they had to periodically empty the house and flush it out and refurbish it. As to how many days in a calendar year they spent here, I would have no idea. But I would suspect not more than half the year.
Yes. The rest of the time they'd be at court, I guess.
They'd be at court or they'd be off doing other things. You know, Henry Grey for a while was warden of the North Marches and he was up in barrack. So they were moving around fulfilling their duties. They were off visiting somebody. We have lots of documentation of Francis visiting various people in various places. The mother, Margaret Grey Wotton, was off visiting in various places. She tended to favor Tilty down in Essex. So can't really say how much time they actually spent here. Yes?
I'm sorry if I'm asking you a personal question,
No, please.
but tour guides here, my goodness, us tour guides, we all do our own poking around to make sure the stuff we deliver is accurate. So we do a lot of our own research.
Right.
How do you get all this stuff living in Palm Springs? I mean, I'm serious. Is it all on the internet, or what?
It is now. When I first started out doing
this is the question. When you first started, I mean, my goodness.
we were just talking about this a little earlier.
I asked an even more blunt question, which was, does presenting this as an American come an immediate barrier?
And the answer is yes, it does. Yes, it does. Who the bloody hell is this American coming over here telling us about our history? I get a lot of that, believe it or not. The simple fact is, when I did my PhD, you get all sorts of funding. People literally donate money to you. You would call them bursaries here. I got quite a number of bursaries to come over and do research in the archives. And since then, I've continued to do it. Prior to COVID, I used to come over here 3 or 4 times a year, every year, religiously. Since COVID, I've not been over here quite so much. But I go to the British Library, I go to the National Archives, I go to Leicester and Rutland Records Office, I go to the Tower of London Archives, I go here and I go there. And I dig through the archives. But since the internet, or the interwebs as I like to call it, has become such a huge thing, the vast majority of what I need to do my research is online now. Yeah. Roger Ascham's book is online. I mean, there's a whole long list of stuff. And it just keeps growing day by day. There's a website, I don't know if you're familiar with it, called archive.org. Excuse me. It is, it's a sort of crowdsourcing kind of thing where universities and libraries and whatnot will do digital scans of what's in their collections and post it to the internet. When I first started out, there were maybe 100 books on archives.org. Now it's in the hundreds of thousands. So a lot of this material that I've referenced is available on archives.org or other places.
Oh, good.
In fact, to that point, About 5 years ago, I did a simple, just woke up one day and decided to do a simple Google search, Lady Jane Grey. And up popped this book that I'd never seen before, printed in 1571. Nobody knew anything about it. And it had 2 letters written by 2 Italians in London in 1553 that saw the events going on, and no historian knew a thing about it. But thanks to the internet, voila, there it was.
Thank you.
On your research, have you come across a physical description of Jane?
No, there is none. Good question, though. Richard Davey and his hideous novel. He wrote a supposed account of Jane's entry into the tower. The entry into the tower was a good thing. This was not her going into prison. It was her taking possession of the tower as the monarch of England. Davy supposedly found in an obscure Genoa archive this letter from one of the Genoese ambassadors named Baptista Spinola, that gave a physical description of, you know what I'm talking about, that gave a physical description of Jane Grey. Leander de Lisle published an article in the New Republic magazine, 2013 or 14, I think it was, that said, this letter's not real. This is a fabrication. And then I came along behind her and did a more academic textual analysis of the content of the letter and backed her up, and have since published that sort of account. That letter is entirely a fabrication, as is much of everything else in Davy's book, which is why we have, the story we do today that's based largely in myth. There is no written description. People, again, as with birth dates, people were not concerned with appearances back then generally. Even Elizabeth I, I recently had reason to need to know what color her eyes were. One person mentioned the color of her eyes and said they were black. How many people do you know with black eyes? No one mentions physical descriptions. They're described as pretty, comely, handsome, that sort of thing. But no, this tall, that wide, etc. Rarely, once in a blue moon, you'll have somebody mention, if it's an unusual sort of thing, they'll mention an odd aspect of their appearance. But if they appear like normal people, they generally will not be described.
Your alternative site for where she might be buried, when did that...
If she's not buried here, that came up as we were touring the ruins. There is a slim possibility she was buried here.
When did that stop being a churchyard?
It still is. Technically, it still is a churchyard. If you notice when you go in the Tower of London, they have all these real short little barriers all the way around.
No, sorry, the alternative church where...
Oh, sorry. World War II.
Oh, right, okay.
This Church of Holy Trinity Miners got bombed into oblivion by the Germans.
Okay.
It was part of the Blitz. And it was entirely obliterated.
Okay.
So there's no hope of going in and doing excavations and things to find her body, as it were.
They built the hotel, sure the body's out.
That's a very good question. I would like to know, because here in the UK you do have this thing where they have to do archaeological digs to prove that there was nothing down there. It may be that the site that was the building that was there before this current hotel, that hotel does not date to World War II. That's obviously very new construction. I don't know if they did an archaeological, sort of test dig to see if anything was down there. They might have done, but I've never been able to find record of it. I have looked, and I've never been able to find record of it. If there was a building built on the site shortly after World War II, there would not have been one done. That didn't become popular until, the rebuilding had reached a point that they weren't in such a hurry, basically.
Quick question, sorry. You touched briefly on Jane's relationship with Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that one instance of them visiting one another, is there any more information of how close their relationship was
Yes.
or wasn't?
There is. In this period, people didn't do Christmas gifts, they did New Year's gifts. And they exchanged New Year's gifts. We know that, it's documented. Mary's jewel inventory survives in Mary's own hand, and she writes marginal notes and said this was given to so-and-so and that was given, or this was received from so-and-so, whatever. And that falls in there. She also Mary would have been present at a lot of these events that Jane was present at. Mary of Guise's reception in London. They seemed almost certainly to have been relatively close, since Mary was so very reluctant to execute her in the fall of 1553, and did so only because the Spanish absolutely demanded it as a condition of the marriage between Mary and Philip of Spain. Otherwise, in all probability, Mary would have pardoned Jane and let her live. She did pardon Jane's father once and made him pay an enormous cash bond, which Henry, of course, then violated. But Mary tended to be, despite her reputation as Bloody Mary, that wasn't her. That was her bishops that were doing that. Mary tended to be a fairly forgiving person because mercy is a Christian virtue.
Just one aspect of that which gets brought up from time to time, I wonder what your view on it is it's sometimes said that she was being pushed towards making confession, renouncing her Protestant faith, and would she sign up to being Catholicism being the true religion.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be reasonably well documented, but it's sort of done on the basis that, it's part of this sort of pious myth that she absolutely refused, and therefore she was executed. I wonder what your take on that is.
Okay. First, I'm going to challenge you and say that she wasn't actually pushed to convert. That's a misreading of the debate that she had with Feckenham. Jane's execution was scheduled for a particular date. John Feckenham was Mary's personal confessor. He was an abbot, a priest, so on and so forth. And he went to Mary and said, hey, you want to restore the Catholic Church in England, wouldn't it be the most marvelous coup if we could convert Jane Grey? And Mary said, not a bad idea, and dispatched him to the Tower to have this debate. Now, these debates were always public. This wasn't two people in a prison cell in the dungeon having a talk. This would have been public with an audience. And they transcribed the debate with the intention of publishing it. If Feckenham could have won the debate, yes, that would have been a big deal. Turns out Jane kind of basically won it. Had Jane converted, which number one, she never would have done, but had she converted to Catholicism, she probably still would have been executed because she was a focal point for more rebellion. Let's get rid of Mary. We don't like what she's doing. We'll put Jane Grey back on the throne. So as long as Mary was like her father in that regard. Henry VIII and Henry VII were extremely good at eliminating anybody that might pose a threat to the crown. Anybody that had a claim to the crown, off with their head. Mary did the same thing. So Jane would have lost her head either way. She could have gone Catholic all day long and they still would have cut her head off. John Dudley went Catholic, famously, just before he was executed, still cut his head off. Yes?
A couple of answers ago, you just said something in passing that I've never heard before, that her execution was demanded by the Spanish.
Mm-hmm. It was a condition of the marriage contract because, again, Jane could be a focal point of rebellion, and the last thing Spain wanted was to be dragged into an English civil war should Philip wed Mary. Spain would be obligated to assist Mary if a civil war broke out over who had the claim to the throne. Spain didn't want that. Spain was too busy fighting France in Italy for control of Italy. So they said, if Philip's going to marry Mary, Jane's got to die. We don't want any rebellions.
So is it that the Spanish insistence then that her two sisters were kept in very close control? Is that part of that?
Probably not. You mean Catherine and, no, that was Catherine and Mary's own doing. Because Catherine secretly married the Seymour, Edward Seymour. There were so many Seymours, Edward, William, etc. She secretly married him without permission. That's an act of treason. For an heir to marry without the permission of the crown is an act of treason. And she did that in 1562. So Elizabeth had been on the throne for only 4 years at that point, barely that. And that made Elizabeth angry. So she threw her, and of course then she promptly popped out 2 boys and Elizabeth wasn't married and had none. Catherine was Elizabeth's heir until Catherine died in 1572, I think it was, and then her sister died in 78. The sister also married and may have had a child. That was a huge threat to Elizabeth. So Elizabeth had to stick them off in prison somewhere. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So it wasn't a result of the Wyatt Rebellion. She was executed then.
Who?
Jane.
No. Well, yes and no. Jane was destined to die regardless of Wyatt's rebellion. The marriage contract was agreed before Wyatt's rebellion. Wyatt's rebellion occurred late in January, January the 28th. Jane was executed on February the 12th, so about 2 weeks later. But the marriage contract had already been signed before then, and it was a condition of the contract that Jane had to die sooner rather than later. If anything, Wyatt's rebellion sped that up and reinforced for the Spanish that they had taken the right position to begin with. Because lo and behold, right after we signed this contract, rebellion breaks out. Somebody wanted to put Jane back on the throne. Wyatt did not. Wyatt wanted to put Elizabeth on the throne. Jane's father wanted to put Jane back on the throne. Yeah, I know. How do you keep track of all this? More questions? I love questions.
I'll ask the question I asked you earlier. Should we call her Queen Jane?
Yes. Yes. And I say that for a multitude of reasons. The first of which is none other than the royal family's own website, I think it's royal.co.uk, lists her as a Queen of England. So if King Charles III accepts Jane as his royal ancestor monarch, good enough for me. However, she was proclaimed, she was recognized by all of the authorities of the day, the Privy Council, the Mayor of London, the head of all the guilds of London, the bishops, the Archbishop of Canterbury, etc., etc., etc. They all signed this agreement, yes, Jane is Queen. They misjudged the public opinion. And the public went for Mary. They didn't know who Jane was. They had no clue who she was. She was very obscure at that point. It would be kind of like having, some royal 15 places down the line inherit Charles's throne, just to make any sense. So Mary was able to rally support so very, very quickly that they had to back off of it very quickly. But she did rule. The courts we have court records from the period that the court met in the name of Queen Jane. So, yes, she did rule for that period. She ruled for 13 days, not 9, but everybody refers to her as the nine-day queen.
She's not on the scroll, though, is she?
The scroll.
With all the,
I don't know what scroll you're referring to.
it was a big one with all the names of
The monarchs.
monarchs,
Yeah.
and she's not on that.
That whoever created the scroll just decided not to. That's all I can tell you.
It's been done over the centuries, I think.
I'm not familiar with it. You mean something that was started a long time ago and continued through to the present?
Yeah.
I'd love to see that. Send me an email and tell me where it is.
I've seen it on TV, that's all.
I've never heard of it. I have no idea. I'm having difficulty imagining a scroll being created back then that had enough paper at the bottom of it to continue it to the present day. Okay. Sort of cut and paste together? Okay. No, seriously, if you can recall where that is, send me an email and let me know. I would love to know. This is why I like question and answer sessions, because you always learn something new from the audience.
So, yeah, I remember that from school. In the school days, you used to talk about that as well.
Really?
You go back a lot of years.
I went to school in America, I'm sorry. Actually, I went to younger school in the Caribbean, so you're really not going to learn about it there.
So the 13 days then,
Mm-hmm.
we know that, a lot of us, but what we normally say is it was because she wasn't announced straight away, and that's the
Correct.
difference between the 9 and 13. We're correct on that.
You're correct that that's the reason modern people call her the 9 days queen. However, it was fairly customary in the period not to announce the death of the monarch until everything had been put in place to make sure there wasn't going to be an outbreak of civil war, to make sure that there wasn't going to be somebody come along and say, no, I'm the right one, he's the wrong one. reach back to the 12th century. Matilda, daughter of Edward I. She was not in the UK when she inherited. Stephen of Blois was. Blois ran to Winchester, which is where the capital was then, and said, I'm a cousin, I'm the king. And the civil war that followed is known today as the anarchy. So that's what they tried to avoid. It's a modern thing that they announced the death of the monarch and the accession of the new one immediately. That's entirely modern. So that 3-day period, unless you want to call that a period with no monarch, which is kind of not really possible, then her reign started actually at the instant that Edward VI died, which was on Thursday the 6th, and then lasted until the 19th, which is a span of 13 days. But you're right, they did not proclaim her as queen until Monday the 10th, which was over 3 days after Edward died. But there are reasons for that delay that I'll go into another. I want to tell you guys, by the way, I'm doing 2 lectures at the Society of Antiquaries of London on Thursday. Both will be live streamed on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and then look for Society of Antiquaries, and then click on the live tab, you'll be able to watch those lectures, and after they're over, they will be posted as recordings. And I'm going to discuss that very topic in the second of those lectures. Oh, are you? Excellent. Excellent.
Train ticket and I'm hooked on.
Excellent. I'll have a familiar face in the crowd, so I'll be looking at you the whole time.
There's 3 of us coming.
Excellent. I'm excited.
Obviously, you know it.
Yes, yes, I know you're coming. Excellent. Jim, I know you're coming.
So, just quickly, is that Jane's our first queen then? England's first queen?
Tech-
My queen, that makes sense.
Was Matilda a queen or not?
No, she was not queen because I think Jane...
She didn't even style herself queen. She styled herself Lady of England.
Yes,
So yes, technically, Jane was the first, Jane Grey. Dudley, I'm always very careful to try to add the Dudley to the end of it. Technically, she was the first queen. And if another Jane comes along, she will be Queen Jane II.
If you could all just agree this in the next few days, please, because we've just received some funding to do new interpretation. So I could do with an answer in the next few weeks. But if you want Bradgate to be the place where we start calling her Queen Jane,
I would love it. I would love it.
Then let's do it.
Some of us have been doing it, not in our toes for ages. We think
Let's get it in writing. Let's get it in writing.
We had this discussion earlier. One of the reasons I think she's known as Lady Jane Grey instead of Queen Jane Grey is because all these people that were writing about her 10, 15, 20 years after she died, it would have been treason to describe her as Queen Jane. So they keep her old title. Because if you say Queen Jane, you're supporting her over Mary, Elizabeth, etc. Therefore, you've committed treason. Off with your head.
My question was about the marriage to Guildford.
Mm-hmm.
And
Good one.
yeah, whether it was consummated or anything like that. But what is the evidence of the happiness or whatever of that marriage?
Jane's own,
Because of the respective illnesses and after post-marriage.
Jane's own account, she confirms the marriage was consummated. She says in her account, there was, and that's another one where we get into a whole controversy about myths. Supposedly, Jane wrote a letter to Queen Mary outlining her view of what happened immediately after it happened, probably in August of 1553. The minute Mary became queen, the minute she succeeded in acquiring the throne, Giovanni Commendone came from Italy, was dispatched from the papacy to come to London and monitor events and report back. He was a high-ranking cleric and he had direct access to Queen Mary. And it's his account of Jane giving her account. So it's kind of hearsay. Mary was in the Tower. It was customary for the new monarch to take possession of the Tower. So Mary we know for a fact, go into the Tower of London and lived in the big white tower for the first week or so of her reign. Jane was just a few steps across the way in the gentleman jailer's house, and they were friendly enough. I believe the two of them met in person, in public, in the White Tower, and Jane gave her story, and Commodone wrote it down. In his own words, Commodone says that Jane declared, not that she wrote. Jane declared this, that, and the other. So in all likelihood, it was an in-person meeting. And I'm sorry, I got tangential and lost your question.
The health of that marriage.
Ah, yes. In that account, Jane says that the two of them fought. Guilford and Jane fought. And Jane particularly fought with Guilford's mother, the Duchess of Northumberland, who was also coincidentally named Jane. Actually, her name was Jane Guilford, if you can imagine that. It was probably a relatively rocky relationship at the beginning, but Jane also very explicitly says that they slept together. And that's the word she used, slept together. So, and one of the goals of that marriage was for the two of them to produce a male child. And I feel absolutely certain that Guilford did his best. Did his best.
Do you think that Jane wanted the crown? I mean,
No. Sorry.
Leander Delisle says when she sort of was offered the crown or told she was queen, she sort of fell down, etc. And Leander said, well, basically she knew this wasn't news to her because she was already the first heir, first in line for the throne, and she could have been making it clear that it wasn't of her making, that this wasn't her choice. But then after that, she seems to have been quite assertive, saying, Dudley can only be a duke, he can't be king, etc. Is that something you agree with, or?
I know Leander. I visited with her in her home, actually. I know her quite well. We agree and we disagree on a lot of things. My feeling is that Jane did not want to be queen. Definitely not. She would have preferred to stay home with her books. But circumstances were such that she was made queen. That's the subject of my second debate on Thursday, so I won't go into that. However, the business about her falling down weeping at the news, we must interpret that in its historical context. Women were expected to weep and wail at the news of anyone's death. So for her to have stood there and said, okay, he's dead, so what? That would have been a very big deal. For her to fall down in the floor weeping and carrying on for her cousin that she knew so well, perfectly normal. I don't think that had anything to do, I don't think she was weeping and wailing over the prospect of being queen. I think she was weeping and wailing over the death of her cousin. No, she didn't want to be queen. Others wanted her to be. Second lecture on Thursday, the goal of that whole business was not to make Jane queen. It was to make Guilford king. Stay tuned for the lecture on Thursday. But she did, yes, after she had the office. My own interpretation of it is that Jane says at one point in her confession or account of events is that she turned to God and asked God what was the plan here. What are you doing to me? And her resolve was, I'm meant to be here. God has put me here for a reason. And that reason is that I believe in a Reformed church. So I will do God's work here. And by God, if I'm going to do God's work, I'm going to do it right. So she started signing letters, and I think she took a very active role during those 9 days. As for example, we know that she refused to make Guilford a king. William Paget, Lord Treasurer, came to her and said, try on this crown, we're going to make another one to fit your husband. You're going to do what? Oh, we're going to make him king. Oh, no, you're not. I'll make him a duke, but I'm not going to make him king. And they were all like, oh my God, she's not obeying us. What are we going to do? And that very night, they all fled the tower, and everything went tits up, as you British say. So yes, I think she did not want to do it. Then she did. And then when it was over, whew, let's go home. But she didn't get to go home. Does that answer your question?
You refer back a lot to obviously having contemporary sources, and because so much is written and drawn and so on hundreds of years later. How likely do you think it is that other material will come out in the future that we don't yet know of in archives and so on.
It's possible. As I was just saying, I found a couple of letters thanks to an interweb search, Google search. So it's possible, but it's not really likely because at this point, we've had things like the Historical Manuscripts Commission and some of those that have actively gone in seeking out as many records as they could find. Now, occasionally something will pop up out of a private collection that's never been in a public collection before. I want to say it was Sotheby's, auctioned off a couple of letters last June that had been in private collections forever, not related to Jane Grey, but they were official letters that nobody had seen in God knows how long. I think because so many of the documents from this specific 9-day reign were probably deliberately destroyed, that we're not going to find any. And they were deliberately destroyed because, with the exception of Henry Grey and John Dudley, most of the members of the council went on to serve Queen Mary. So they had to kind of backpedal and, what's the word we use in America now, gaslight, to erase their bad doings. And there's even a document in the British Library where William Cecil has gone back where it says Jana Regina, and he has superscripted in with a caret non. Jane is not the Queen. William Cecil was secretary to the council at this time, so a lot of the documents that are written are in William Cecil's hand. I've spent so much time with those things, I can recognize William Cecil's hand on sight. Jana non Regina. So there was a lot of gaslighting. Yeah, and a document's deliberately destroyed to keep people from looking guilty.
Okay.
More questions?
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
My pleasure. As James says, I was last here in 1987. I did my degree in 2007, and ever since I've done my degree, it's been on my bucket list to do a talk here at Bradgate. Now I've done it. So I feel so privileged and so honored. I'm very grateful to you all.